I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, political analyst Sherif Rizq out of Cairo, and Austin Mackell, freelance journalist and Middle East analyst out of Quito, Ecuador. Thank you both for being with us. Let me start this off in actually Ecuador. Mr. Mackell, since the coup back in July of last year, there's been almost constant strife in Egypt. In your perspective, why is that the case?
Well, essentially what you're seeing is an attempt by a foreign-funded and trained military with the support of a minority in the cities, and a minority who are concentrated in the cities and very visible on social media and in the international press, working to try and deny the democratically expressed will of the Egyptian people. The Muslim Brotherhood won every major electoral contest they entered, including the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections, and that has got them nothing but even more obscene and horrific repression than they were experiencing under the Mubarak regime. And it's a very terrifying development, really, because you've got to remember that within political Islam inside Egypt, there's been for a long time a debate between those who advocated using violence, like we saw today at the Cairo University with the Cairo University bomb attacks, and those who said that the way for political Islam to advance.
Okay, well, let me cross over to Cairo. Hopefully we'll be getting our guest back on in Ecuador. Mr. Rizzi, your perspective on the same question. What's the major cause of what we're seeing? Because it appears that we're seeing a continual deterioration of the situation inside of Egypt.
Well, the situation is quite clear. We got a group called Muslim Brotherhood that's quite immature politically. They don't know how to play the game of politics. And we've seen the practices of Morsi for 1 year. He was quite immature, unable to really rule a country, unable to prove that he got one stable political stand throughout 1 year. Even during elections, one village in Minya was banned from taking part in the presidential elections because they were Christians and they were completely against Morsi. So lots of practices were quite autocratic. They cannot even talk about democracy if we talk about Muslim Brotherhood. Besides, there is nothing called the political Islam. Islam is a religion, politics is politics. So people claim that they know something about politics. They are quite immature. They know nothing about the game. They know nothing about the power factor. They know nothing about building up a country. They know nothing about organizations. Very simple example. If you look at the way Morsi has chosen his consultants, it's quite immature. He only got his friends and Christians so that he can make a balance, but they didn't have a role. So you can be democratically elected, same time you rule autocratically.
Okay.
Besides, if you look at the international scene and you look at Ukraine, the president of Ukraine was democratically elected, right? But then the Americans and the other supporters ousted him by the help of some people in the capital, Kiev, which is the poor part of Ukraine. Okay. So you cannot talk about democracy in a world that's ruled by power factor.
All right, let me turn back to, I think we have our guests back, Mr. Mackell. Your perspective, hopefully you heard what our guests in, in Cairo was saying, that basically the chaos, the root of the chaos is the Muslim Brotherhood itself and its lack of maturity as an organization.
In a sense, he's right. The root of the chaos is the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters who represent the biggest political constituency in Egypt, and their refusal to cede to an entitled class, of which I think our colleague might be a member, who see themselves as he said, uniquely qualified to rule the country of Egypt. They don't see their fellow countrymen who aren't fully immersed in what I would call imperial etiquette as qualified to rule. It doesn't matter if they win elections, there must be something wrong. I mean, the kinds of complaints about autocracy that are launched against Mohamed Morsi there's whatever validity they might have, they pale in comparison by scales of magnitude to what's happened since the coup. According to the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, more than 2,500 peaceful protesters have been gunned down by security forces since the coup. And the Muslim Brotherhood claim a higher number. They claim 2,500 were killed in a single massacre in Rabaa. And their numbers aren't entirely incredible. They've repeatedly in the past actually come up with the real numbers, and the government has lied. It's a dictatorial, deceitful regime that has reasserted itself with the help of a liberal class that were too scared to really stick to the rules of democracy when they lost the elections. There's a study that I think really helps. Our colleague was saying that you can't talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and you can't talk and democracy in the same sentence. One thing that I think helps the situation make sense is understanding the sort of ambiguity of politics in Egypt. There was a poll conducted by Pew in 2012, just as the sort of chance to bring down the Morsi government were really 2012, when the chance to bring down the Morsi government were really gaining steam. And it asked Egyptians and many other people in the region, but in Egypt the question was rather, do you believe in Sharia law was one question, and do you believe in democracy was the next question. Both questions got more than 80% of respondents saying yes.
All right, let me get Mr. Rizq. I'm sorry, let me get Mr. Rizq back in on this discussion. Mr. Rizq, let's look at what our guests have talked about, some of the numbers. We're looking at thousands of demonstrators who have been killed since July 3rd, when this new regime took over. And we are looking at many, many people in jail. And of course, just recently, we saw over 500 people in one shot sentenced to death. Do you not think that some of these actions are actually the cause of what we're seeing, all of this upheaval?
Okay, in politics, nothing is one factor thing, it's multi-factor. So if you look at the whole situation, there is a part of it that the government is bearing responsibility, which is lack of training. So the police are not really well trained. So they got lots of problems in terms of organizing the situation and making discipline. And I think the problem started from the time that Prime Minister Shafiq, that in 2011, actually was stepped down because people shouted, down, because he only belonged to Mubarak's regime. And this was not a good reason. So since then, things started to really go wrong. The second thing is that you cannot blame the government for gunning down somebody who's carrying a gun or a Molotov. So if there is somebody is using violence, so the government or the police have the right to respond or to initiate or to control discipline. I think that what you mentioned at first, that the police are using heavy-handed process, actually it's not right. I think they are shaky. They are not really using heavy-handed, otherwise things wouldn't have gone that far. If you remember what happened in London a few years ago, when Prime Minister of England actually said, don't talk to me about human rights when national security is in danger. The same situation applies in Egypt. National security is in danger, so we cannot talk about getting people the full rights to demonstrate using violence. And this is not demonstration, actually.
What about that, Mr. Mackell? What do you say to that, Mr. Mackell? Let me switch over. What do you think about that?
I would say that again, that there is an element of violent confrontation against the state, but that's been claimed mostly by groups like groups well outside, like by groups outside anti-coup coalition. The anti-coup protesters are going out again and again in a very peaceful manner and getting rewarded for that with violent suppression. So again, this is helping the argument of terrorists that if the peaceful methods aren't listened to, and that helps them in their recruiting efforts and makes them more of a viable option. Secondly, our colleague said that the police in Egypt are not well trained. They are very well trained. They're trained, in fact, the training and funding and equipment comes from the United States. I remember when I was in the streets outside Tahrir, when I was in Egypt during 2011 and 2012, a fellow reporter remarked to me that the techniques they saw the Egyptian police using were exactly the same as the ones they saw the Israelis using in the West Bank against Palestinians. I remember, which is very reminiscent of what when the 2011 revolutions first broke out. There was a line that we are seeing the end of occupation of Arabs by Arabs. Well, that's back, and now the Egyptian army is busy occupying Egypt on behalf of foreign powers who fund it to the tune of $1.5 billion a year, at least, that we know about.
All right,
That's
stay with
the US.
Okay, stay with me, both of our guests, Mr. Rizq and Mr. Mackell. Let's cross over to check out some of our Facebook viewers, what they have put on our page.
As long as Egyptians don't unite to cut their ties with Americans and subbing American policy like Iran did, nothing will happen. It's a direct consequence of USA backing up military coup in Egypt. The coup d'etat destabilized the country. The military-backed government had increased its brutal repression of protesters without any criticism from the Western media. Political tensions? Egyptians are losing their lives, and the country is heading to destroy itself. Military leaders are using their power instead of their heads. Sad, sad. General al-Sisi has no rights to run for president. He's a criminal having overthrown a legitimate and democratically elected president. Looks like Israel is in bed with Egypt. I would like to think Egypt has the stick, but also looks the other way around.
Well, let's cross over back to Mr. Rizq. So what do you think about some of the comments? Do you think that what we're seeing in your country is a direct result of what many said, of our viewers said, as far as the U.S.'s support for what most people would claim as a military coup back in July 3rd of last year?
No, you cannot say military coup at all. And in terms of definition, in terms of reality, in political science is based on what's happening in reality, and then it writes about it. So it's not the other way around. What happened in Egypt was quite unique. It was the people headed out in the streets, millions of people, and then the military supported them. The same exactly as what happened in Jan 25th. So if you call Jan 25th a coup, you call June 30 a coup. So it's not a coup at all. And it's all about mutual interest. So the Americans had interest in what happened in Jan 25th. But then in June 30, they do not have interest. So that's why they kind of labeled it the way they liked. If you talk about, what else did you ask about? Sorry?
Well, stay with me with that. Let me let our other guests respond. Go ahead,
Okay.
Mr. Mike.
Sure, I just wanted to say that it's exactly that political science is meant to reflect reality, and there is no way you can reflect reality without calling what happened a military coup. It was also a military coup against Mubarak, but there's actually been research done on this, believe it or not, to show that military coups against dictators tend to increase democratic outcomes, whereas military coups against elected leaders don't, which is also what common sense would imply. The difference between a military coup against Mubarak, an unelected dictator, and a military coup against Mohamed Morsi, who was the first honestly elected president in Egypt's history, and ask the Carter, you can argue with the Carter Institute about that, don't argue with me, and to annul his election and have a military coup shows a profound disrespect for the votes of the majority of Egyptians, and that is profound disrespect underpins the entire Tamarod pro-coup June 30 narrative. This idea, which our colleague has come back to multiple times about in work he's written previously as well as today, about the Brotherhood of Islamists not being qualified to govern. It's because he is setting himself up as some kind of philosopher king here. Him and his buddies at the American University are the only ones who can say who's qualified to govern a country.
Okay, let me get Ms. Rizq back in here. You had something to say. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, if he says about Mubarak who's a dictator and Morsi is not a dictator, that's a self-contradictory statement. Like, Morsi gave himself rights to issue laws, Mubarak did not. Morsi had contact with Hamas and had contact with Qatar, and actually we had very bad relationship with Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Bahrain, and that's national security. That during the time of Morsi was a fiasco, and there is something in political science called recall, and a recall is when voters got the right to ask to get their calls back,
and the Egyptian
to have a
Constitution,
referendum, and that's what
Constitution,
Morsi refused.
which a majority of the Egyptian
He keeps interrupting me. Can I answer, or will he answer instead of me? He keeps interrupting.
Go ahead, Cairo.
Excuse me. Okay. If somebody, for example, recall, and that happened in the USA 4 or 5 years ago in one of the states, the sheriff did not actually adhere to the constitutional rights in the USA. So the voters went back to the ballots. So that's what we asked Morsi to do. People are not happy. Millions headed out in the streets. You got to listen to people. He did not listen to people. So we asked for a referendum. He refused. So what shall we do? The same thing happened in Ukraine, and everybody approved it. I mean, it's quite strange. I mean, people interpret things according to
Okay, go ahead, Miss. All right, go ahead, Mr.
He
Mackell.
keeps interrupting. He has
Let's not
to
get
wait.
into the Ukraine, which is a whole
He
other
has
issue.
to
Yeah,
wait.
we don't have time
to
to get in Ukraine. Go ahead, Mr.
No,
Mackell.
no,
Go ahead and respond if you
My
like.
point would be that if they were really
now?
if the Brotherhood were really so unpopular, there were parliamentary elections scheduled for September of last year after Mubarak's cronies dissolved
It
the
was
first
illegal. The parliamentary
parliament
election was
in
illegal,
Egypt.
and we had the constitutional
The
court.
parliamentary election was meant to be in September.
That they should
If the
against
Brotherhood
it.
had been so unpopular,
No,
anti-Brotherhood forces
the
could have
parliament
blitzed
elections
those
were
elections
illegal
and
in Egypt. If you
impeached
don't know,
Morsi
you have to check.
via the democratic methods.
No,
They
the
couldn't do
parliamentary
that.
election was
They knew they
illegal.
couldn't do that. That's why they teamed up with the army and quit the whole democracy game. And the US is perfectly happy to let that happen. And if you want to talk about undermining Egypt's national security interests, opening Egypt's intelligence and military doors to Israel and America is the greatest defeat that Egypt suffer, and it's already suffered it.
Back to Cairo, because we're just about out of time. Your take, sir. What will it take to bring peace and stability to Egypt?
You always ask to bring peace and stability. If we ask the initiators, the Muslim Brotherhood is creating violence in the street. The government is only responding to that violence. So we can ask them first to stop using violence, because even during Morsi, all the religious satellites urged people to go violent. They even urged against Egyptians. They urged against and they agitated people against the Christians and the minorities and the Shia. And 4 Shia got killed because of Morsi allowing somebody to talk against the Shia in the stadium. He had Zomor, one of the people who assassinated the Sadat in the celebration of 6 October war. Morsi was a traitor. He was not a real president. And we are very happy we got rid of him.
All right, and Mr. Mackell, your take. What will it take to bring peace and security to Egypt?
It would take the foreign powers and their local stooges, such as our colleague in Cairo, to stop deciding who is a legitimate Egyptian and who is not a legitimate Egyptian citizen. He says he wasn't a real president. He won an election. That's how you become
the
president.
People decide who is legitimate.
In a
out
country.
in the street
He won
to
an
decide
election that all the international observers had said was
we decide.
the president fairest in
we are the people, we decide
in Egypt.
Morsi was not illegitimate.
Let's see what they say about the election of Sisi, that this guy, which I am certain will proceed. We're rushing towards at the moment. Let's see what the international observers say about
so
the
sorry,
election.
but I have to interrupt both of you because we are out of time. I appreciate you being with us. Political analyst Mr. Sherif Rizq out of Cairo, and Mr. Austin Mackell, freelance journalist and Middle East analyst out of Ecuador. Appreciate you both being with us, and always, viewers, we appreciate you staying with us right here at Press TV on the analysis of the debate. Thank you so much. I'm Marcia Hashemi. See you same time, same place tomorrow.